January 1943. The North Atlantic. The water temperature is 2 degrees above freezing. The sky a bruised and indifferent gray. Somewhere beneath the surface, a German U-boat glides silently through the darkness, waiting. On the convoy routes above, merchant ships struggle through 50-foot swells, carrying the fuel and food and ammunition upon which an entire civilization depends. And somewhere between them and safety lies a gap, 300 miles wide, a void in the air above where no Allied aircraft can reach. The men who sail into it know what it means. They call it the Black Pit. In London, in the winter of that year, a scientist named Geoffrey Pike sits in a drafty government office, surrounded by papers and cold tea, and he is thinking about ice. What Pike is contemplating is not a defensive measure, not a piece of radar technology, not a new depth charge or a longer-range torpedo. He is thinking about something so fundamentally strange, so structurally improbable, that most of the men he will eventually present it to will laugh. Some will laugh nervously. A handful will see, through the absurdity, a glimmer of something that might just work. Pike is thinking about building an aircraft carrier out of frozen water. Not a small one, not a prototype. He wants to build a ship 2 kilometers long, capable of housing hundreds of aircraft and thousands of men, capable of crossing any ocean, capable of surviving enemy fire because its wounds would simply be frozen over and repaired. He wants to build it out of the one material Britain has in unlimited supply, ice. And he wants to build it in the middle of the North Atlantic, where the problem is greatest and where nothing else has worked. The project will be called Habakkuk, a biblical name chosen with characteristic Pike eccentricity from a minor Old Testament prophet. And the reason Britain came so close to actually building it reveals something extraordinary and deeply disturbing about how desperate the situation had become. To understand why a serious military organization would entertain the idea of an ice ship, you have to understand what was happening in the Atlantic by early 1943. The German Navy's U-boat campaign, the Battle of the Atlantic, was not merely a strategic inconvenience, it was an existential threat. Between 1940 and 1943, German submarines sank over 2,600 Allied merchant vessels, killing more than 30,000 merchant sailors and sending 8 million tons of desperately needed cargo to the ocean floor. The mathematics were brutal and simple. Britain imported the vast majority of its food, its oil, its raw materials. Without those convoys, the country would starve and the war would be over. Not in months, but in weeks. Churchill later wrote that the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war was the U-boat menace. He did not write that lightly. The solution, everyone agreed, was air cover. Aircraft could spot submarines, force them to dive, attack them with depth charges, and report their positions to surface vessels. But the distances involved were colossal. The longest-range aircraft available in 1942, the American consolidated B-24 Liberator, could cover roughly 2,400 kilometers, 1,500 miles, from a base in Iceland or Newfoundland. The Black Pit sat stubbornly beyond that reach. Convoys entering it were on their own. The obvious solution was to put airfields in the middle of the ocean. Conventional aircraft carriers existed, but they were desperately scarce, hideously expensive, and already stretched thin across multiple theaters of war. Escort carriers, smaller, cheaper versions, were being built, but the production lines were slow and the ships were still vulnerable to both submarine and surface attack. Something radical was needed, something cheap, something fast to produce, something that could be built in numbers and placed precisely where the gap existed. In December 1942, Geoffrey Pike sent Winston Churchill a memo. It ran to 200 pages. Pike was not by any conventional measure a military man. He was an intellectual, a journalist by background, an inventor by temperament, and a figure of such eccentricity that he reportedly conducted meetings from his bath and once arrived at a military conference in a dressing gown. But he had a mind of unusual lateral scope, and when he turned it to the problem of the Atlantic Gap, he arrived at a conclusion that was preposterous on its surface and genuinely compelling underneath. Ice floats. Ice is found in abundance in the North Atlantic and Arctic, precisely where the problem exists. Ice is essentially free. Ice can be shaped, carved, and constructed into forms of enormous scale. And ice, crucially, does not burn. A conventional carrier struck by an enemy bomb might be set ablaze, its fuel and ammunition igniting in catastrophic sequence. A carrier made of ice would simply absorb the explosion and freeze over the damage. The technical challenge was making ice strong enough and stable enough to serve as a floating runway. Natural icebergs, while impressively massive, are structurally unpredictable. They carve, they roll, they fracture under stress. What was needed was a form of ice that behaved less like a natural formation and more like a construction material. The answer came unexpectedly from a collaboration between Pike and a team of researchers at the National Research Council of Canada in Ottawa, working under Dr. Max Perutz, a man who would later win the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for entirely unrelated work on the structure of proteins. What Perutz and his team discovered, experimenting in a meat locker in the Smithfield Market district of London and later in a refrigerated facility in Canada, was something they came to call Picrete, a portmanteau of Pike's name and concrete. The recipe was deceptively simple. Take ordinary water, add approximately 14% by weight of wood pulp, the kind used in paper manufacturing, cheap and widely available. Freeze it. The resulting material bore almost no resemblance to ordinary ice. Normal ice shatters under impact, cracks along internal fault lines, and collapses under sustained pressure. Picrete did none of these things. It was extraordinarily tough, roughly as strong as concrete according to laboratory measurements. A bullet fired into a block of Picrete would penetrate only a few centimeters before stopping, its energy dissipated by the fibrous wood pulp matrix. The material could be machined, drilled, and shaped like timber. It melted far more slowly than pure ice because the wood pulp provided insulation, and when damaged, it could be repaired simply by applying more Picrete and allowing it to freeze. In a demonstration that became legendary in British wartime circles, Lord Mountbatten, then Chief of Combined Operations and Habakkuk's most enthusiastic high-level champion, reportedly produced a block of Picrete at a meeting of the Allied Chiefs of Staff in Quebec in August 1943. To demonstrate its resistance to small arms fire, he drew his revolver and shot it. The bullet ricocheted off, narrowly missing an American admiral. Whether the story is entirely accurate in all its details is unclear. Accounts vary. But the underlying point was real. Picrete was genuinely remarkable. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It lets this channel keep making programs exactly like this one. The proposed ship that would be built from Picrete was staggering in its ambition. The design called for a vessel 610 meters, 2,000 feet, in length, roughly 3 times the length of a modern aircraft carrier. The beam would be 90 meters, 300 feet. Displacement would be approximately 2.2 million tons, making it by orders of magnitude the largest vessel ever constructed. The hull would be 12 meters, 40 feet, thick at the sides, insulated by a wooden cladding, and kept frozen by a system of refrigeration pipes running through the structure like arteries. The ship would require 26 separate refrigeration units, more than the largest cold storage warehouses in Britain. The deck would accommodate 100 or more Spitfires or other short-range fighters, protected in hangars carved into the ice itself. Workshops, quarters for a crew of several thousand, ammunition stores, and fuel tanks would all be housed within the body of the ship. Top speed would be a modest 6 to 7 knots, not designed for maneuver but for presence, for permanence, for the simple ability to exist in a particular stretch of ocean and project air power over it. Estimated construction cost was £700,000, a figure that would rise dramatically in subsequent analysis, but that compared extraordinarily favorably with the cost of a conventional carrier at several million pounds. And the materials were largely not subject to the rationing and shortage that bedeviled conventional construction. Timber for the wood pulp was plentiful in Canada. Water was everywhere. The refrigeration equipment was specialized but not impossible to produce. To test whether the concept was viable in practice, the Canadians constructed a scale prototype on Patricia Lake in Alberta, deep in the Rocky Mountains, in the winter of 1942 to 1943. The vessel, if it could be called that, was roughly 18 meters, 60 feet long, and 8 meters, 26 feet wide. It took a crew of men working in intense cold 3 months to build. It was kept frozen by a single small refrigeration unit. When the Alberta summer arrived, it did not melt quickly. It sat on Patricia Lake well into the warmer months, resisting the sun with what observers described as an almost indifferent solidity. The men who built it called it the bug ship. They were proud of it. Whether it would have translated to a 2-kilometer ocean-going vessel was a rather different question. Actual operational deployment of Habakkuk was never achieved, and the surviving documentation on what trials and tests were conducted is fragmentary. What is known is that the project attracted what it represented more than anything else was the measure of Allied desperation in the winter of 1942 to 1943. When a government seriously contemplates building a 2-million-ton ship out of frozen wood pulp, it is not because things are going well. The men dying on the North Atlantic convoys, the merchant sailors whose ships disappeared into the Black Pit with no hope of air support, they were the reason Habakkuk existed. Their deaths made the idea seem not merely plausible but necessary. The psychological impact of the project on those who knew of it, and very few did, given its classification, was reported by contemporaries as genuinely strange. There was something simultaneously inspiring and deeply unsettling about the notion that Britain's situation had become so acute that ice was being seriously considered as a solution. It was a testament to ingenuity. It was also an acknowledgement of how limited the alternatives were. The prototype on Patricia Lake in Alberta rests on the lakebed today, a corroded tangle of refrigeration equipment some 9 meters below the surface. Divers have located it. There are interpretive signs on the shore explaining what it was and what it was meant to become. It sits in one of the most beautiful stretches of mountain landscape in Canada, in water so clear that on calm days you can see the bottom from the surface. It is not a dramatic ruin. It is a quiet one. A small plaque was installed near the lake in the 1980s when the project was partially declassified. It describes Habakkuk in measured, factual terms. It does not mention Jeffrey Pike by name. It does not convey the desperation behind the idea, the long nights in cold offices, the meetings where grown men argued seriously about the structural properties of frozen sawdust. It does not explain what was happening in the Atlantic while those arguments were taking place. But perhaps those things do not need to be on a plaque. Perhaps they are already visible to anyone who looks carefully enough in the simple fact of what was being attempted. You do not build a ship out of ice because you are winning. You build a ship out of ice because you cannot think of anything else, and because the ocean is swallowing your people alive, and because you will try anything at all. If there is even a fraction of a chance, it might help. January 1943, the North Atlantic. The Black Pit stretches across 300 miles of grey water, and in the gap between the aircraft and the convoys, the U-boats are hunting. In London, a man in a dressing gown is writing a 200-page memo about ice. The war has reached that particular kind of desperation where the impossible starts to look like the only option left. Jeffrey Pike's ice carrier was never built, but the fact that it was seriously, rigorously, expensively attempted, that is the measure of how close the Battle of the Atlantic came to being lost, and how extraordinary the minds were that Britain threw at the problem when ordinary answers ran out. The ship of ice melted into history. The gap it was meant to fill was eventually closed by other means. But Habakkuk remains, in its magnificent impracticality, a monument to the strange and terrible creativity of a nation fighting for its life. You do not forget a weapon made of ice. You are not supposed to.